Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving into a case that's, it's a bit of a doozy. It's got medicine, murder, and a legal term that sounds like it's straight out of a horror movie. We're talking depraved heart murder. You gave us a true crime podcast about this doctor, James Ryan, who's facing this really unusual charge.
Yeah, depraved heart murder. It's definitely not your everyday legal term, is it?
Not at all. So break it down for us. What exactly does depraved heart murder mean?
Okay, so it falls under the umbrella of second-degree murder, right? But here's the catch. The prosecution doesn't have to prove intent like they would with first-degree murder.
So premeditation, like planning it up beforehand, that's not the focus here.
Nope. But, and this is a big but, they do have to demonstrate this extreme disregard for human life. We're talking about actions so reckless, so indifferent to the outcome, that it's basically like saying, I don't care if someone lives or dies.
Whoa. And in this case, the allegation is that Dr. Ryan, he gave his girlfriend, Sarah Harris, a fatal cocktail of drugs. Is that where this whole depraved heart thing comes in?
You got it. Prosecutors are basically saying, look, this guy's a doctor, he knows the risks associated with these drugs, and yet he supplied them anyway.
So it's like his knowledge actually makes him more responsible, not less.
Exactly. That's a key part of their argument.
Now, the podcast also mentioned that Ryan was hit with a whole bunch of other charges too, right? Not just this depraved heart thing.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking involuntary manslaughter, drug distribution. It sounds like a pretty complicated legal web.
It is. With involuntary manslaughter, you're generally looking at an unintentional killing that resulted from reckless behavior. And then, those drug charges, they add a whole other dimension to the case. The prosecution had to be really strategic in how they approached this to make it all stick.
It's definitely a lot to unpack. But before we get too bogged down in the legal jargon, I want to step back for a second and talk about Sarah Harris, Dr. Ryan's girlfriend. The podcast really painted a picture of her life before she met him. What kind of person was she?
Right. It's crucial to remember that Sarah was a person, an individual with her own story, her own struggles. This isn't just a case file. It's about a real human being. And then you have her mother, Tina, who the podcast focuses on quite a bit. Just try to imagine the unimaginable grief, losing one daughter, then another just a year later. And to make matters even more tragic, her son had passed away just 18 days before Sarah's death.
Oh my gosh, it's heartbreaking. And initially she saw Dr. Ryan as this, kind of a perfect match for Sarah, successful doctor, all that. It just goes to show how appearances can be deceiving.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in outward appearances, especially when someone has a certain status, like a doctor. But as this case shows, that doesn't guarantee good character.
There's even this really intense body cam footage from the podcast of Tina confronting Dr. Ryan after Sarah died. The raw emotion in that moment is it's powerful.
It's a stark reminder that beyond all the legal arguments, beyond the courtroom drama, this is about real people, real loss, and the ripple effects of tragedy. But listening to that confrontation, it makes you wonder, why didn't Tina go to the police sooner if she was already suspecting something was wrong?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. If she was worried, why not act immediately?
Well, it's not always that simple, is it? The podcast suggests that Dr. Ryan was very good at explaining away Sarah's behavior, making it seem like everything was perfectly fine. Plus, Sarah herself was begging Tina not to involve the police, even threatening to cut off contact. Can you imagine the pressure on Tina? The fear of pushing her daughter away? It was a terrible no-win situation.
That's a tough spot to be in, absolutely. And then just when you think it can't get any more complicated, the podcast drops this bombshell. Tina reveals that Ryan's been interested in Sarah for years, going back to when she was just 14.
Talk about unsettling. It turns out Ryan would actually hang out at places where Sarah worked, seemingly just to catch a glimpse of her. And don't forget, he was 23 years older than her. That age gap, it just casts a whole new light on their relationship, doesn't it? It raises those questions about grooming, about potential abuse of power, especially given his position as a doctor.
Oh, definitely. Red flags were there from the start.
But what was the actual evidence that led to the charges being filed against Dr. Ryan? What did investigators find that connected him to all of this?
Get this. Sarah's sister, Rachel, plays a crucial role in uncovering the truth. She basically breaks into Sarah's laptop and stumbles upon these incredibly incriminating text messages between Sarah and Dr. Ryan.
Well, hold on. So it's the sister who cracks the case wide open, like something out of a movie, right?
It is. She manages to guess the password, gets into the laptop, and boom, there it is.
Yeah.
Evidence staring her right in the face.
So what were these text messages actually saying? Spill the tea. Well, there are three main things that jump out. First, you see Sarah texting Ryan about her anxiety, about how she's having trouble sleeping, and his response. He offers her injections as a quick fix. Talk about a major red flag.
Oh, that's bad. And coming from a doctor, it probably sounded even more convincing, even though it was totally unethical. What else is in those texts?
It gets worse. There are messages where Sarah's practically begging Ryan for specific drugs like ketamine and propofol, serious stuff, and he's actually providing them. This is where his medical access becomes a weapon. He's using his position to provide these dangerous substances.
So he's not just giving her any random meds. He's providing powerful, potentially deadly drugs. This is getting scary.
And it gets even scarier. There's one text where Ryan admits to injecting Sarah with drugs while she was asleep. Consent, out the window. This shows you the power dynamic, how Ryan was manipulating and taking advantage of Sarah in her most vulnerable state.
Wow, that's just messed up on so many levels. But wait, there's more, right? Didn't Rachel also find something else besides the texts? She took those pictures of what looked like surgical drugs at Sarah's place.
Yeah, those pictures are key. They back up the text messages and help paint a timeline of Dr. Ryan's involvement. It's not just Sarah saying she got drugs from him. Now there's physical evidence to corroborate it.
So you have the texts, you have the photos, this whole suspicious relationship. It sounds like an open and shut case, right?
Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? But it turns out there was a huge misstep early on. The first responders at Sarah's house, they thought it was just your typical heroin overdose. They totally missed the bigger picture.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah.
With all that evidence staring them in the face, they missed it completely.
They didn't have the right expertise, I guess. The photos Rachel took showed this unusual medical equipment, but the first responders were laser focused on signs of heroin, which weren't there.
And that's where Detective Ian enters the picture. He's the pharmaceutical expert, the guy who knows all about this stuff, right?
Yeah. He's like the Sherlock Holmes of pharmaceuticals. He sees those photos, recognizes the equipment, and knows something's fishy. He's the one who pushes for the depraved heart charge and breathes new life into the investigation.
It makes you think, what if Detective Ian hadn't been involved? Could Dr. Ryan have gotten away with it? Would this have just been another tragic overdose, chalked up to bad luck?
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? It highlights how much we rely on specialists, on people with that deep knowledge to see what others might overlook. Anyway, thanks to Detective Ian's expertise, the case goes to trial. And the verdict, guilty on all charges.
Wow, guilty on everything. Depraved heart murder, involuntary manslaughter, drug distribution, the whole shebang. So what happened at the sentencing? What kind of punishment did Dr. Ryan receive?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The judge decided to throw the book at him, handing down a 45-year sentence. That's way above the usual guidelines for these types of crimes.
Whoa, 45 years. That's a serious sentence. Why do you think the judge went so hard on him?
You got to think about it from the judge's perspective. He was likely sending a message. This kind of behavior, especially from someone in a position of trust, like a doctor, it simply won't be tolerated. There are serious consequences for exploiting vulnerable people.
Yeah, it definitely sends a message. It makes you think about the ripple effects of this case, not just on Dr. Ryan, but on the medical community as a whole. Could this lead to changes in how doctors are trained, how they prescribe medications?
It's a definite possibility. This case really shines a light on the potential for abuse when it comes to prescription drugs. It's a wake-up call for other doctors, reminding them of the responsibility that comes with their power and the severe consequences if that power is misused. And it's not just talk. The podcast mentioned that there are actually efforts in Maryland to change the laws around drug suppliers in overdose cases, potentially making it easier to hold people accountable.
So real change could come from this horrible situation.
Potentially. This case might be a catalyst for tougher laws, stricter guidelines when it comes to prescribing those controlled substances. It could even lead to shifts in how medical professionals are trained and monitored. But let's not forget about Sarah and her family. The podcast ends with Tina visiting Sarah and Christopher's shared grave, and it's just heart-wrenching.
Yeah, the podcast really emphasized Tina's strength, her resilience, but you can't help but feel the immense weight of her grief, the pain of losing two children in such horrific circumstances.
It's a sobering reminder that for all the legal and ethical discussions, at the center of this story is a mother who has endured the unimaginable. But what struck you the most about the podcast? What really resonated with you? You know, for me, it's Detective Ian's role that really sticks with me. He's the one who saw those photos and thought, wait a minute, this isn't just another overdose. He was thinking outside the box, connecting those dots that everyone else seemed to miss. Makes you wonder how many other cases are out there where that kind of specialized knowledge, that expertise, could be the key to solving them.
You're right. It's like he was the only one who could see past the surface, read between the pixels of those photos, and see the truth. It just shows you how important it is to have those experts, those people who can look beyond the obvious and see the bigger picture. But even with his expertise, this whole depraved heart murder charge, it still seems kind of tricky to prove. It's not as straightforward as, say, proving someone planned a murder, right?
Exactly. That's what makes this case so fascinating from a legal standpoint, anyway. It all hinges on proving extreme disregard for human life, which, let's be honest, can be pretty subjective. Prosecutors have to convince that jury that the actions go way beyond just being careless or negligent. They have to show a complete and utter indifference to human life.
And in Dr. Ryan's case, they used his medical knowledge against him. It's almost like they were saying, look, you knew better than anyone what could happen. You understood the risks, and you did it anyway.
It was a smart strategy, that's for sure. They turned his expertise into a weapon, demonstrating that he was fully aware of the potential consequences in a way that the average person wouldn't be. But it also raises some questions about the medical profession itself, don't you think? Like, could this case lead to changes in how doctors are trained or how they prescribe certain medications?
That's a great point. I'm curious about that, too. It's hard to imagine something like this not having a ripple effect on the medical field.
It's definitely possible. This whole case is a harsh reminder that even doctors, with all their years of training, their oath to do no harm, they can still make terrible mistakes. Mistakes with devastating, even fatal consequences. Maybe this will lead to stricter guidelines for prescribing those controlled substances, more oversight, a renewed focus on the ethics of patient care.
It's a wake-up call that accountability applies to everyone, regardless of your job title or your status. But there's something else I'm thinking about, and it's a little tricky. The podcast mentioned that Sarah was struggling with anxiety, insomnia, and she was the one asking for the drugs. Doesn't that complicate things a bit?
That's a really good point. It reminds us that addiction is complex, it's a disease, and it can drive people to make choices they wouldn't normally make. Of course, it doesn't excuse Dr. Ryan's actions at all. He was the one with the power, the responsibility in that relationship. But it does add another layer of nuance to this whole story.
So how do we reconcile that? You have this doctor clearly abusing his position, but you also have this woman struggling with addiction who is reaching out for help, even though it was in a really unhealthy way.
I think it's important to remember that Sarah was still a victim in all of this. She was seeking help, and tragically, she put her trust in the wrong person, someone who exploited her vulnerability instead of offering genuine support.
It's a tragic reminder that those in positions of power, especially those responsible for our health and well-being, have a duty to use their knowledge for good, not for harm. And that those struggling with addiction deserve compassion and real help, not manipulation and access to dangerous substances.
Absolutely. And speaking of power dynamics, think about how technology played a role in all of this. Those text messages between Sarah and Dr. Ryan, they were crucial in proving his guilt. They gave a clear picture of what was really going on.
It's crazy how our digital footprints can become evidence, right? Those texts were like a window into their relationship, revealing Dr. Ryan's true intentions. But it also makes you think about privacy in our digital age. I mean, we're leaving trails of data everywhere we go.
You're right. It raises a ton of questions about how our personal information can be used in ways we might not even expect, like a criminal investigation. And in this case, it was Sarah's sister who accessed those messages. It adds another layer to this whole thing. Was she right to invade Sarah's privacy, even if it ultimately led to justice?
That's a tough ethical question, no doubt. It's hard to say what's the right thing to do in a situation like that. But I'm glad she did it, in this case anyway. Those messages exposed what Dr. Ryan was really doing.
I agree. It speaks to this difficult balance between privacy and seeking justice. Sometimes even actions that seem morally ambiguous can lead to a greater good.
The podcast also talked about potential legal changes in Maryland, specifically about how they deal with drug suppliers in fatal overdose cases. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's the right move?
It's complicated, that's for sure. On the one hand, it seems like a no-brainer to hold those people accountable for supplying drugs that lead to death. But on the other hand, we don't want to just criminalize addiction, punishing people who are already struggling. The goal should be to address those underlying causes of the opioid crisis, making sure people who need help can actually get it without fear of being prosecuted.
It sounds like finding that balance is key. Laws that discourage dangerous behavior, but also offer compassion and a path to recovery. It's not about punishing those who are already suffering. It's about stopping these tragedies from happening in the first place.
Exactly. It's about addressing this problem from all angles. Prevention, treatment, and yes, holding those who exploit vulnerable people accountable for their actions.
This case really highlights the importance of family and support networks, especially when dealing with something as devastating as this. Sarah's family was shattered by her loss, but they also showed incredible strength and resilience, supporting each other through the darkest of times.
It's a real testament to the power of those family bonds. They came together, they fought for justice for Sarah, and ultimately they found a way to honor her memory. And Tina, wow, her strength in using her pain to help others is truly remarkable. It shows that even in the face of unimaginable loss, we can still find a way to make a positive impact on the world.
It's a message of hope amidst all the darkness. I gotta admit, though, this whole case has left me with this unsettling feeling. You have this successful doctor respected in his field, and yet underneath, there's this darkness, this deeply disturbing behavior. It's a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that we can't blindly trust people in positions of authority, even doctors.
I hear you. It's a wake up call to be more discerning, to pay attention to those red flags, and to trust our gut instincts. And to remember that abuse can happen anywhere, even in those seemingly perfect relationships.
And it got me thinking about Sarah's family and friends. The podcast mentioned they had concerns about Dr. Ryan, but they hesitated to get involved. What advice would you give someone in a similar situation? What should you do if you see those red flags but aren't sure how to act?
It's tough, that's for sure. You don't want to overstep, but you don't want to just stand by and potentially watch someone get hurt. I think it all starts with education, with awareness. We need to understand those different forms of abuse, the warning signs, and the resources that are out there to help. There are hotlines, websites, organizations dedicated to supporting people in these situations.
Knowing is half the battle, right? The more we understand about abuse, the better we can recognize it and do something about it. But even when we recognize the signs, it can still be scary to speak up. What would you say to someone who's afraid to get involved?
Fear is a natural response, but we can't let it paralyze us. Remember, your voice has power. If something feels off, don't be afraid to express your concerns to the person you're worried about. Let them know you're there for them, you care, and you're willing to listen.
Just being a listening ear can make such a huge difference. And if you're worried about their safety, their well-being, don't hesitate to reach out to a trusted friend, a family member, or a professional. Get advice, get guidance.
You absolutely don't have to go through this alone. There are people who can help, people who understand the complexities of these situations, and who can provide support and connect you with resources.
And what if you're on the other side of this? What if you're the one experiencing abuse? What advice would you give to someone who feels trapped in a harmful situation?
First and foremost, you are not alone. You deserve to be safe, to be treated with respect. It takes incredible courage to reach out for help. But know that there are people who want to support you, who can help you get to a place of safety. Reach out to someone you trust, a friend, family member, call a hotline, visit a website dedicated to domestic violence or abuse. There are resources available, and you absolutely do not have to go through this alone.
That's such an important message. There's help out there, no matter how hopeless things may feel. You don't have to suffer in silence. This deep dive has been eye-opening, a bit unsettling, to be honest. It shows that even behind those seemingly normal facades, there can be darkness lurking. But it's also a testament to the power of the human spirit, the ability to overcome adversity, to seek justice, and ultimately to create positive change.
It reminds us that we all have a part to play in building a safer, more just world. We can educate ourselves about abuse, we can support those who are struggling, and we can hold those in power accountable for their actions.
So as we wrap up this episode, I want to leave you with this. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, chances are it is. Don't be afraid to ask questions, to seek help, or to speak up for yourself or for someone else. You never know whose life you might be saving. It's amazing, really, how she took this horrific experience and used it to make something good, for herself, for others. It's really powerful to see that kind of strength in the face of such loss.
It's a perfect example of how, even in the darkest of times, we can still find hope, find purpose. But it brings us back to that question that's been hanging over this whole case. How could someone like Dr. Ryan, a successful doctor, someone who dedicated his life to helping people, how could he end up doing something so awful?
Yeah, it's a tough one to wrap your head around. On the surface, you have this respected professional, but then you peel back the layers and there's this dark side, this disturbing pattern of behavior. It's almost like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation. It really shows that you never know what's going on behind closed doors, even with people you think you know.
And it reminds us that those in positions of authority, the people we're taught to trust, they're not immune to making terrible choices. Sometimes that status, that power, it makes it even easier for them to get away with harmful behavior. It's up to us as individuals and as a society to be more critical, to question those in power, and to hold them accountable for their actions, no matter who they are.
The podcast really stressed the importance of recognizing those warning signs, those red flags in relationships. They mentioned that people close to Sarah had concerns about Dr. Ryan, but were hesitant to step in. It makes you think, what can you do when you see those signs, but you're not sure how to react? What advice would you give someone in that situation?
It's a tricky situation, no doubt. You don't want to overstep boundaries, but you also don't want to sit back and watch someone potentially get hurt. The first step, I think, is education. Understanding those different forms of abuse, the warning signs, the resources that are available to help. There are hotlines, websites, organizations specifically dedicated to supporting people in these situations.
Right. Knowledge is power. The more we know about abuse, the better equipped we are to spot it and to take action. But even when we recognize those signs, it can still be scary to get involved.
What would you say to someone who's afraid to step in? Fear is a natural human response, but we can't let it paralyze us. Remember, your voice matters. If something feels off, don't be afraid to express your concerns to the person you're worried about. Let them know you're there for them, that you care, and that you're willing to listen without judgment.
Sometimes just listening, just offering that support can make all the difference in the world. And if you're truly worried about their safety, their well-being, don't hesitate to reach out to someone you trust. Talk to a friend, a family member, or a professional. Get advice, get guidance.
Absolutely. You don't have to navigate this alone. There are people out there who can help, people who understand these complex situations and can provide support and connect you with the resources you need.
And what about those on the other side of it? What if you're the one experiencing abuse? What advice would you give to someone who feels trapped, who feels like they have nowhere to turn?
If that's you, know this. You are not alone. You deserve to feel safe, to be treated with respect. It takes immense courage to reach out for help. But remember, there are people who want to support you, people who can help you find a path to safety. Talk to someone you trust, call a hotline, visit a website dedicated to these issues. There are resources available, and you don't have to go through this alone. You deserve better.
It's so important to remember that there's always hope, even when things seem darkest. There is help out there. You don't have to suffer in silence. This deep dive has been, well, it's been a lot. It's eye-opening, it's unsettling. It reminds us that even behind those seemingly ordinary lives, there can be darkness hidden. But it's also a story of strength, of resilience, of finding justice and creating positive change.
It reminds us that we all have a role to play in building a world where everyone feels safe and respected. We can educate ourselves about these issues, we can support those who are hurting, and we can hold those in power accountable. We can all be part of the solution.
So as we wrap up, I'll leave you with this. Trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't be afraid to ask questions, to reach out for help, to speak up for yourself or for someone else. You never know. You might just change a life. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.